Okay, then. Right, so if, as I believe, the world is run by a select group of people, it begs the question, how did this come about? Well, it's my opinion that if you go back to the start of the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, a certain group of people took over the United States of America. They saw a fortune to be made in the production of arms, which was highlighted in the American Civil War, and they also capitalized on the discovery of oil in America in the late 19th century. On top of this, they took over the financial system of the United States, and these things gave them the wealth and the power they craved. But they set their sights across the Atlantic to Europe as well. And I believe this same group of people took over Russia around 1913 and began to set about changing Russia forever. And if you don't believe this, there's a certain Tsar and his family who could testify to it if they hadn't been slaughtered in 1917 by these people. So, as well as now controlling America and controlling Russia, these puppet masters were probing into Europe as well. And lo and behold, by 1914, Europe was involved in the greatest war of all time at that stage, World War One. So the United States were dragged into this war, and along with the Allies, the good guys, yeah, they won this war. And it created an unbreakable bond between the United States and Great Britain. But at this time now, the puppet masters weren't happy with their lot. Their intention was to take over all the world's financial systems. But in the 1930s, they came across a thorn in their side in the shape of a country who was dragging itself out of the ashes of World War One and on its way to becoming another world superpower, but doing it all on their own back without the assistance of the United States financial system. Well, they couldn't have this, the puppet masters. A country couldn't see to be successful without their aid and without their finances. So what happened? They dragged this country into the disgrace that was World War Two. And it's during World War Two that the puppet masters really bared their teeth and showed their power. And they showed their ruthless streak by basically sacrificing Pearl Harbor and hundreds of American lives just to drag America into the war. And drag America into the war they did. And because of this and the aid of their other puppet country, Russia, and the Allies for what they were worth, the UK and France, they defeated, after 5 years, Germany and destroyed Germany as a country for years to come. So they'd set about causing the destruction of a country they envied and feared, and they achieved their goal. But this only caused more greed in the minds of the puppet masters. Yeah. By now, they're controlling most of the world's financial systems. They're controlling most of the world's mass production of weapons. They're controlling most of the world's oil, the American oil, along with the oil that was discovered in the Middle East in the early 20th century. So you think they'd be satisfied, but no, they realised that the world would not any longer have the stomach for such a devastating, life-taking war as World War Two. But yet they still wanted the gravy train to continue. Okay? Now in the 1940s, the puppet masters, the elite, they set up a series of world organisations. In 1947, they set up the CIA. 1948, they set up the World Health Organization. 1949, they set up NATO. And all these organizations would have a key role to play in the future agendas of the puppet masters. But what were they going to do now to attain more wealth? Okay. Quite simply, what they did was they created a Cold War. They created a Cold War between two countries they had total control over, the United States and Russia, the two largest countries, the two superpowers in the world. They created a Cold War that went on for 20, 30 years between these two countries. Okay? They used the lapdogs, their mouthpiece in the media, and they used Hollywood, yeah, to give the world an appearance of a devastating threat. News stories flying about of Russian submarines in American waters, and Russian missiles in Cuba, and nuclear weapons being mass produced in both countries, and the president having a red nuclear button on his desk, and the Russian president having the same, having a button to launch nuclear weapons in an instance. Yeah. All this fear and all this spreading of scaremongering, and all the while the puppet masters making billions and billions of dollars for themselves, yeah, by selling their weapons to each side. Yeah. You know, the world's paralyzed by fear, paralyzed by the fear of a nuclear war during this Cold War. A Cold War, I might add, where hardly one shot was fired, and they say the whole world cannot be fooled. I beg to differ. The Cold War was all a hoax, a creation in order to create and attain more wealth for the puppet masters. And even then, they were still not satisfied. So what did they do? They invented a space race. And guess what? A space race again between the United States and Russia. A space race that was going to make millions and billions more for the puppet masters by selling their technology, by selling their spacecrafts. Okay? How did they get away with all this? Quite simply, they got away with the two greatest lies of the 20th century because they controlled both of the countries involved. At the end of the space race, we've got the Americans walking on the moon. 2 years after the first decent pop-up toaster was invented. And when you argue with people about the moon landings, one of the arguments they give is this. Well, the Russians would have known if the Americans hadn't landed on the moon, and there's no way the Russians would have stayed silent. They would have called the Americans out for the lie. Well, did you ever think of this? Maybe the Russians lost the toss. Or maybe the Americans were given the dubious accolade of being first on the moon because they were the ones with the facilities through Hollywood, also owned by the elite, the puppet masters, the ability through Hollywood and their studios to set the whole damn scam up. Maybe that's why the Americans were given first shot at walking on the moon. Dear. Anyway, they got away with it because they were both controlled by the same group of people. Okay. Now, another thing that the puppet masters have been complicit in doing all through the last decades is eliminating ruthlessly any threat to them or any threat to their lies and to their agendas and to their intentions and to their atrocities. Okay? And this was proven completely in the 1960s. First of all, the assassination of JFK, who basically called them out of the shadows. Then we had the assassination of his brother, Bobby Kennedy, later on in the 60s, simply because he was following in his brother's footsteps and was also going to be a similar threat to the puppet masters. In between these assassinations, we had the assassination of Martin Luther King. And he was assassinated because he was showing that he could effect change for the black people in America and attain equality for the black people in America by peaceful means. You need to understand the puppet masters, the rulers of this world, they do not profit from peace. They profit from aggravation, from division, from conflict. So Martin Luther had to go as well. And even women have not been exempt from their assassination squads, women who've posed a threat to their existence. Ask Princess Diana, ask Marilyn Monroe, and even ask poor Jill Dando, who was assassinated, yeah, because she intended to highlight paedophilia at the top echelons of society, reaching as far as the puppet masters. You see, these puppet masters for 50 years now have basically ruled the world governments, have controlled the world governments. Okay? They've had the governments in their pockets to do their bidding, to carry out their agendas. And even in the last 50 years, the puppet masters have had a massive push to try and push Europe into becoming one European state. Because they know a European state with a government, a hierarchy that they can easily buy off, will be far more easy to control than individual countries with their own individuality, their own individual history, their own individual perception of themselves. Far easier to control them all as a group. Why do you think in Britain our mainstream media pressed so hard, 99% of them, all against Brexit? Do you think it was their own personal views coming through? Absolutely not. The mainstream media is owned by and controlled by the puppet masters. And the way they so fiercely fought with every little dirty trick in their book, yeah, to remain in Europe, to get Britain to remain in Europe, is basically proof in my eyes that they were simply just carrying out the wishes and the instructions of their paymasters, the puppet masters, who want just one European state. Where are we now anyway in this, what I call this world, which is basically a dictatorship by stealth? Where are we? We're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, okay? We're in the middle of initiated race tensions, racial tensions. And why? Because once again, we're all being forced, as we were during the World Wars, as we were during the Cold War, we're all being forced to live in a world of fear. Yeah. Fear caused by the lies and the deceit and the deceptions of the rulers of the world. We're being forced to live in a world full of sheep, full of compliance, yeah, basically full of people so easily fooled, even with all the advantages we have over our predecessors, the advantages of media, the advantages of the internet, the advantages of libraries full of books and knowledge. Okay? Basically, we've been presented with an opportunity to actually find proof for ourselves of the things that are happening right in front of our eyes. And yet so many of us still refuse to do so and would rather take for granted what them women are telling us on that little screen in our living room. It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's soul destroying, and it's frustrating that this world won't, for fuck's sake, wake up to what's really happening on our planet and do something about it in order to free us all, to allow us all to live equally as free people on this planet of ours, which is the way nature, God, or whoever created us intended it to be. Until next time, guys, feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe, have a chat. Bye for now.